The roadside diner sat at the edge of a long, desolate highway, a beacon of light in the middle of nowhere. The neon sign above flickered intermittently, buzzing softly against the silence of the night. A warm glow spilled from the windows, casting inviting shadows onto the cracked pavement outside. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sizzling burgers, freshly brewed coffee, and the faintest hint of motor oil from the mechanics who often stopped by after long shifts. The walls were lined with faded photographs of truckers, locals, and old race posters, giving the place a nostalgic charm. The diner was a haven for regulars, farmhands, truckers, and weary travelers. At the counter, an elderly man stirred his coffee absently while flipping through a newspaper. A couple of teenagers occupied a booth in the corner, their laughter blending with the soft hum of a jukebox playing an old rock ballad. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where people sought comfort in the familiar rhythm of routine. But tonight, that peace was about to be disturbed. At a booth near the window, sat alone, methodically cutting into her steak. She had the look of someone who had seen more than she let on, sharp eyes, an unshaken presence, and a quiet confidence that set her apart. She wasn't from this town, and yet she blended in easily. Dressed in a simple black t-shirt and faded jeans, there was nothing overtly remarkable about her, until you looked closer. The way she moved, the way she carried herself, it spoke of discipline. Trained hands, quick reflexes, an awareness of her surroundings that was second nature. The diner had long been a for regulars, all seeking a brief respite from the road. The warm glow of neon lights flickered softly against the rain-slicked pavement outside, casting elongated shadows across the nearly full parking lot. Inside, the air carried the familiar scent of. It was a place where the world outside seemed to pause, where folks took comfort in the predictable rhythm of everyday life. At the counter, and stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, his gaze drifting over a that had seen more mornings than it should have. He wasn't really reading, just passing the time. A few stools down, a pair oft-heard deep voices blending with the soft hum of an old playing from the jukebox in the corner. Across the room, a couple of their heads bent close together as they scrolled through a phone, their laughter muffled yet vibrant. The occasional clink of cutlery against plates and the rhythmic filled the quiet spaces between conversations. It was the kind of place where faces were familiar, and where nobody paid too much mind to, but tonight, that was about to be. At a booth near the window, methodically cutting into her steak within, she wasn't rushing. She wasn't distracted. She was simply her flicked up briefly, scanning the room in a way that seemed casual, but wasn't. Every detail, the way the waitress shifted nervously behind the counter, the way a man at the far end of the room kept glancing toward the door. Even a growing tension. She wasn't from this town. And yet, she dressed in a simple, there was about her at first glance. No flashy jewelry, no elaborate hairstyle, no attempt to draw attention to herself. But if you looked closer, really you'd see it. The way she sat, always the way she held her fork and knife, the way her fingers occasionally tapped the table, she had the look of someone who had seen. Someone who had been to notice things that others missed. Someone who didn't, but was always, and soon enough, trouble would come. Sarah had spent years in the completing multiple tours in Afghanistan. She had seen combat, lived through situations most people couldn't even fathom. And now, she just wanted peace. She had left that life behind, trading the battlefield for quiet nights and simple meals. But trouble, as always, had a way of finding her. The distant growl of motorcycle engines shattered the calm. From the parking lot, pulled in, their headlights cutting through the darkness. The low rumble of their Harleys vibrated through the ground as they parked haphazardly near the entrance. They swung off his bike first. Tall, broad-shouldered, and cocky, he moved with the swagger of a man who expected the world to step aside for him. His leather jacket was worn, the patches on his vest marking him as part of a gang that had a reputation for stirring up trouble. Beside him was his enforcer, and knuckles that had broken more jaws than he could count. He wasn't just big, he was mean, the kind of guy who enjoyed making others feel small. Trailing behind them were three more bikers, grinning, restless, looking for entertainment. And tonight, entertainment meant throwing their weight around. As they stepped inside, the energy in the diner shifted. Conversations slowed, eyes darted toward the group, but no one dared to say anything. Everyone in town. Sarah didn't react when the bikers entered. She kept eating, kept her focus on her plate. Jax, however, was already looking for something, or someone, to challenge. His eyes scanned the diner, looking for a target. Then he spotted the young waitress scrambling behind the counter, balancing plates of food in her hands. She had been working here for years, always polite, always trying to keep her head down when trouble walked in. Jax grinned. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "Why don't you bring me a coffee? And don't keep me waiting this time." Lisa flinched but nodded quickly. "Right away." She hurried to the coffee pot, hands shaking slightly as she poured. The last time Jax had come in, he had spent the night making crude jokes at her expense, grabbing her wrist when she tried to walk past. When they came around. Sarah from her booth. She didn't say anything. Not yet. But her grip on her fork tightened. Jax noticed Lisa's nervousness and chuckled, nudging Bruno. "She's scared of us, man. Ain't that cute?" The other bikers laughed, loud and obnoxious. As Lisa rushed over to deliver the coffee, she onto the counter. Jax's smirk disappeared. "What the hell, Lisa?" he snapped. "You trying to burn me?" I'm sorry," Lisa stammered, stepping back. Jax towering over her. The diner went dead silent. And that's when one of the bikers, trying to get a reaction, making her drink slosh in its cup. Sarah the biker smirked. "Oops." She held his gaze, her face unreadable. Jax, noticing her for the first time, turned his attention toward her. "Look at this," he mused, stepping closer. "A little lady all by herself. You don't look like you belong here." Sarah said nothing. Just on her napkin. The bikers laughed. Lisa had been moving fast. Too fast. In her rush to serve the table, her hands trembled slightly, and she misjudged the weight of the steaming coffee pot. A few drops sloshed over the rim, landing on Jax's thick leather vest. He froze. For a split second, then, his chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the waitress. His jaw tightened, nostrils flaring, as he slowly looked down at the dark stain spreading across his chest. Even the jukebox seemed to hesitate, the low hum of an old rock tune barely audible over the mounting tension. The truckers at the counter exchanged wary glances. The elderly man stopped stirring his coffee. The teenagers in the corner sank deeper into their booth, eyes darting between Lisa and Jax. Lisa, her hands gripping the coffee pot as if it were a shield. What the hell, Lisa?" Jax snarled, his voice low and sharp like the edge of a blade. "You trying to burn me?" I'm sorry," she stammered. Her voice trembled, but Bruno chuckled darkly from his seat. "Bet she ain't even got the guts to look him in the eye." Lisa, trying to mask the fear in her expression. But Jax saw it. He thrived on it. One of the other bikers, a wiry man with decided to push it further. As Lisa reached for a glass of water to steady herself, he to make her drink slosh violently in its cup. A few drops spilled over the rim, splattering onto the counter. The biker smirked. Lisa's face burned with humiliation, but she said nothing. She simply grabbed a rag and started wiping the counter, her movements quick, almost frantic. That's when a voice cut through the tension. "Leave her alone." The biker. Slowly, he turned, his gaze landing on a woman seated near the window. She wasn't at him. She wasn't even visibly. She just, unflinching, unreadable. The biker's smirk wavered for just a second. Jax, noticing the shift in attention, finally turned to look at her. A woman. Alone. Sitting with her arms resting lightly on the table, napkin still in hand. Jax's lips curled into a smirk. Well, he mused, stepping closer. His boots thudded heavily against the floor with each step. "Look at this. A little lady all by herself." He stopped just beside her table, looking her up and down as if sizing her up. She simply picked up her napkin and, her movements slow and deliberate. Jax leaned in slightly. "You don't look like you belong here." The bikers chuckled, sensing an easy target. Sarah said. She set the napkin back down beside her plate, then slowly reached for her coffee cup, taking a sip as if she hadn't heard him at all. "That him?" Jax had seen plenty of reactions before. Fear. Nervous laughter. Defiance that crumbled the second he pushed. But she just sat there. Composed. Unshaken, and that, That made his smirk falter for just a fraction of a second. The bikers laughed louder, trying to fill the space with noise. But Jax wasn't. Jax leaned on the edge of her table. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Sarah wasn't intimidated. She had seen men like Jax before. Her expression remained neutral, but something in her posture. Her shoulders squared, her breath steady. A small movement, but one that didn't go unnoticed. Jax's smirk faded just slightly. Bruno, watching the exchange, narrowed his eyes. He had a gut feeling about her. But Jax, always eager for dominance, didn't see it. "You think you're tough, huh?" he pressed. "Sitting here all quiet, acting like you're better than us." Sarah finally she looked at Jax and spoke for the first time. "I'm just trying to eat." A simple sentence, but the way she said it carried weight. It wasn't fear. It wasn't submission. It was a warning. Jax chuckled, glancing at his crew. "Oh, I like this one. She's got some fight in her." He leaned in closer. And that's when Sarah met his gaze head-on and a sliver of doubt. A moment of hesitation. He wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had. Lisa's hands trembled as she tried to carry a tray stacked with plates. The weight wasn't the issue. It was the presence of Jax and his crew that made her uneasy. Her heart pounded in her chest as she hurried past their booth, trying not to make eye contact. But in her rush, her foot caught on the corner of a chair leg. The tray tilted. Plates shattered against the linoleum floor. The diner went silent. Lisa froze, her face turning red as she bent down, frantically picking up the broken pieces. Jax let out a loud, mocking, well, would you look at that? Our dear Lisa can't even carry a few plates. Guess they'll let just anyone work here these days." His crew some shaking their heads in fake disappointment. Lisa's eyes stung, but she kept her head down, collecting the broken shards as fast as she could. Then it wasn't one of the regulars. It wasn't the cook behind the counter. It was without a word, she knelt beside Lisa, calmly picking up the pieces, placing them onto the tray. The silent act of kindness wasn't much, but in this moment, it was Jax's smirk faltered as he watched Sarah move. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't hurrying. She was unshaken. Lisa stole a glance at Sarah, who gave her a small, reassuring nod. Sarah wasn't doing this for attention. She wasn't doing it to make a statement. But Jax saw it as their eyes met, Sarah's steady, unwavering gaze locking onto Jax's cold, arrogant stare. For a long moment, there was silence. A was exchanged. Sarah hadn't said a word, but her presence alone was enough to send. "I see you. And I'm not afraid of you." Jax leaned back in his seat, rolling his shoulders. His amusement had turned into he didn't like being ignored. He didn't like when didn't play into his game. And most of all, he decided to change that. He turned toward his crew. "You know, fellas, I think we got ourselves a real tough one here. Maybe she thinks she's better than us." The others chuckled, eager to see where this was going. Jax reached for his glass of whiskey, taking a slow sip. Then, with a deliberate motion, he the cup, letting the liquid onto the floor, right near Sarah's boots. His crew oops, Jax said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Clumsy me." Sarah's gaze remained. She calmly reached for a napkin, wiped the stray drops from her boot, and went back to finishing her meal, the scent a spark of through Jax. Bruno, noticing the shift in his leader's mood, took things a step further. As Sarah reached for her wallet, Bruno blocking her path. "Where you goin', sweetheart?" he rumbled. "We're just getting started." The diner grew a few regulars in their seats, casting worried glances toward Sarah. The cook behind the counter, his hand hovering near the phone. They all knew. Sarah slowly looked up at Bruno. Her expression remained unreadable. "You should walk away while you can," she said, her voice even, steady. The laughter from the bikers for the first time filled the room. Bruno blinked, taken aback by the compliment in her voice. Jax tilted his head, intrigued. "Oh, that's cute," he said, grinning. "You think you're the one in control here?" Sarah didn't answer. Jax chuckled, shaking his head. "Lady, you don't know who you're messing with." Sarah finally set her fork down, pushing her plate away. Then she looked at Jax. "Neither do you." For a split second, but then, like a man too stubborn to recognize danger when it stared him in the face, one of the younger bikers, eager to impress Jax, a mistake. Her hand snapped to Reed's wrist, twisting it at a precise angle, scaped his lips as he dropped to his knees. The diner Reed's breath hitched as he realized she wasn't just strong. She was Sarah didn't tighten her grip any further. She stepping back as Reed scrambled away, clutching his wrist. Jax's grin disappeared. Bruno stiffened. This woman was what they thought she was. The air in the diner changed. Could feel it. Jax not in front of his crew. Not in front of the regulars. If he backed down now, it would make him look weak. And Jax looking weak. He, placing his hands on the table, eyes locked onto Sarah. "All right," he said, voice low. "I don't know who the hell you think you are, but I've had just about enough of your attitude." His crew, some of them shifting uneasily. They had never seen Jax rattled before. "You think you're tough, lady?" Jax sneered. "Let's see how tough." The entire diner held its breath. Sarah. She simply picked up her glass of water, took a small sip, and set it down. Then, Jax expected some he got. Sarah's movements were, as if she slid a few bills onto the table, and then, without a word, turned toward the exit. Jax's the moment she walked out that door, he knew it wouldn't be over. His fists clenched, she simply picked up her glass of water, took a small sip, and set it down with deliberate calm. The noise of the diner faded into a distant murmur, her focus sharpening as she prepared to leave. Jax expected some sort of reaction from her, a retort, a display of fear, or at least a hint of uncertainty. Instead, he got nothing. Sarah's movements were fluid and controlled, as if she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. There was an elegance to her demeanor, a silent strength that radiated from her, catching the attention of every patron in the diner. With a steady hand, she slid a few bills onto the table, her fingers brushing the worn surface with a casual grace. The action seemed insignificant, yet it held weight, a reminder that she was unfazed by the chaos unfolding around her. Then, without a word, she turned toward the exit, her back straight, her posture unyielding. Jax's eyes narrowed as he watched her leave, a storm of frustration and anger brewing within him. The moment she walked out that door, he knew it wouldn't be over. He felt the tension in the air shift, an electric pulse that promised a reckoning. His fists clenched involuntarily, his knuckles turning white as he fought to contain his rage. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had expected to intimidate her, to show her that she was nothing in the face of his crew. But instead, she had stood her ground, and that infuriated him more than he cared to admit. As Sarah stepped into the cool night air, the silence that enveloped her was deafening. The outside world was starkly different from the chaos she had just left behind. The stars twinkled overhead, indifferent to the confrontation she had just endured. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the crisp air, letting it ground her. But inside, she felt the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had handled herself well, but she could sense Jax's frustration simmering behind her, a lingering threat that promised retaliation. She didn't know what he was planning, but she was prepared to face whatever came next. Back inside the diner, Jax seethed, his temper boiling over. "What the hell was that?" he barked at his crew, anger spilling from him like a raging torrent. "You let her walk out. After everything." The bikers shifted uncomfortably, each of them keenly aware that they had just witnessed something unexpected. A woman they had underestimated had turned the tables on them, and their leader was struggling to reclaim his authority. "She's not just some woman, Jax," one of the bikers muttered, his voice low. "She can handle herself." "Yeah, well, she won't be so lucky next time," Jax snapped, his voice cold and calculating. The determination in his eyes spoke of a plan forming, a need to reclaim his dominance and restore the reputation of his crew. As Sarah walked away from the diner, she felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. She had shown them her strength, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Jax would come after her again. The night was far from over, and she was ready for whatever came next. "Let's go," he muttered, jerking his chin toward his crew. Bruno cracked his knuckles, a wicked grin spreading across his face. Sarah had and Jax. He was that. The night air was cool, but tension made it feel electric. The neon lights from the diner's sign cast an eerie glow over the where engines rumbled softly in the background. Sarah stepped out onto the cracked pavement, her boots crunching against the gravel. She rush. She hesitate. She knew they were coming. And sure enough, Jax was the first to step outside, behind him, Bruno and the rest of the crew forming a noose around Sarah. Trapped. At least, that's what they thought. Look at you, Jax sneered, shaking his head. Thinking you can walk in here, embarrass me, and just leave? His voice, but his body language, frustration. Sarah stayed, her gaze flicking over the group, calculating. 5 men. All taller, all heavier. Jax cracked his knuckles, stepping forward. I could have let this slide, lady. But you just had to push it, didn't you? Sarah's expression remained unreadable, and sure enough, Jax was the first to step outside, his anger palpable as he stormed into the dim light of the parking lot. Behind him, Bruno and the rest of the crew followed, forming a loose circle around Sarah, effectively trapping her. The air was thick with tension, the night still except for the distant hum of the diner's neon lights flickering against the inky sky. Trapped. At least, that's what they thought. Look at you, Jax sneered, shaking his head in disbelief. Thinking you can walk in here, embarrass me, and just leave? His voice was laced with venom, but his body language betrayed his frustration. The way he squared his shoulders and clenched his fists indicated that he was struggling to maintain control over the situation. Sarah stayed calm, her gaze flicking over the group, calculating. 5 men stood before her, all taller, all heavier, their muscles coiling like springs ready to unleash their pent-up aggression. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she took a measured breath, centering herself as she assessed their weaknesses and their arrogance. Jax cracked his knuckles, stepping forward with a swagger meant to intimidate. I could have let this slide, lady. But you just had to push it, didn't you? His tone dripped with false bravado, trying to mask the vulnerability he felt after the humiliation inside the diner. Sarah's expression remained unreadable, her cool demeanor contrasting sharply with the simmering aggression surrounding her. She wasn't here to prove anything. She was simply defending herself against a pack of wolves too blinded by their own pride to see the truth. What's it gonna be? Jax taunted, a twisted smile creeping onto his face as he tried to goad her. You gonna stand there and take it like a good little girl, or do you want to dance? He leaned closer, his breath heavy with bravado, trying to break her composure. In that moment, the other bikers laughed, emboldened by Jax's bravado, each feeding off the collective energy of their gang. They were convinced they had the upper hand, thinking Sarah was just a woman alone, foolish enough to think she could stand against them. They didn't realize that the woman before them was a force to be reckoned with. Go ahead, Sarah replied, her voice steady and low, cutting through the noise. You think you're tough? Let's find out. Her words hung in the air, a challenge that shifted the dynamics of the encounter. For a brief moment, surprise flickered across Jax's face, and the laughter of the other bikers faltered. They hadn't expected her to respond so defiantly. But pride quickly took over again. Jax squared his shoulders, determination hardening his features. You're gonna regret those words. As he lunged forward, a reckless fury fueling his movements, Sarah remained rooted, her focus sharpening. She had trained for moments like this, moments where aggression met precision, where skill triumphed over size. Jax swung first, aiming for her face, a wild punch fueled by rage. But Sarah sidestepped effortlessly, her body flowing like water as she evaded his strike. With a quick pivot, she brought her elbow down sharply against his ribs, forcing the wind from his lungs. The other bikers gasped, their confidence faltering as they processed what had just happened. Bruno, seeing his leader falter, charged at Sarah, but she was ready. With a fluid motion, she dropped low, sweeping her leg out to trip him. Bruno hit the ground hard, the thud echoing in the stillness of the night, and for the first time, uncertainty crept into the eyes of the remaining bikers. Don't just stand there, Jax barked, his voice rising in panic as he scrambled to regain control. Get her! But the hesitation had already set in, and the bikers exchanged wary glances, each weighing the risk of their next move. As the remaining bikers lunged forward, Sarah was a whirlwind of motion. She spun, dodging one attacker while delivering a powerful kick to another, her strikes precise and calculated. The sound of fists connecting with flesh and bodies hitting the ground filled the air, drowning out the earlier bravado. Jax's pride was shattered, and his desperation grew. He had underestimated her, and now, his crew was falling apart around him. The laughter and jeers that had once filled the air were replaced with grunts of pain and disbelief as Sarah systematically took down each biker who dared to come near. In a moment of sheer panic, Jax reached into his jacket, his fingers wrapping around the familiar cold steel of a knife. Sarah's eyes locked onto the blade, a flicker of recognition passing between them. She felt no fear, only determination. "Really?" she said, unimpressed by his cowardice. "You think that's going to save you?" Jax's grip tightened on the knife, his knuckles turning white with anger. "You think you're untouchable?" he spat, his bravado slipping as he realized he had backed himself into a corner. "Let's find out," Sarah replied, stepping forward, her body a perfect blend of confidence and readiness. The night had shifted, the balance of power had changed, and the outcome was no longer in Jax's favor. "You done talking?" she asked flatly. "Jax's then, he." Sarah moved like Jax's fist as she sidestepped, completely unfazed. His balance shifted. That's all she needed. Her, precise and brutal. Jax, sucking in a sharp breath. His smirk was Bruno cursed under his breath. What the hell? Sarah, her feet, her movements, she wasn't just fighting. She was them. Jax coughed, gripping his side. The she just some woman at a diner. She wasn't playing their game. Bruno, all, charged like a ready to crush her. Big mistake. Sarah using against him. With a simple pivot, she under his and Bruno went, hitting the pavement where the other bikers hesitated. For the first time, crept into their eyes. But Jax, pride wounded, don't just stand there. Get her. Two more bikers lunged. Sarah sweeping the legs out from the first man. Before he even hit the ground, she spun, delivering A to the second biker's sternum. As he collapsed, gasping. Jax's crew wasn't just losing. They were getting by. Jax's breath was his crew lay around the parking lot, groaning. His as he reached into his jacket and Sarah's gaze locked onto the knife instantly. "Really?" she said, unimpressed. Jax's grip, his knuckles white. "You think you're untouchable?" With a simple pivot, Sarah shifted her weight, effortlessly evading Bruno's lunge. In one fluid motion, she used his momentum against him, expertly grabbing his arm and downward. Bruno stumbled forward, his balance lost, and with a sharp twist, she sent him crashing to the ground with a heavy thud. The sound echoed through the parking lot, a stark reminder of the stakes at play. Bruno hit the pavement hard, groaning as he struggled to catch his breath. For the first time, doubt crept into the eyes of the other bikers. They hesitated, glancing at one another, uncertainty replacing the bravado they had displayed just moments before. "Get up, you idiots!" Jax barked, his pride wounded. He stepped forward, his face contorted with anger and humiliation. "Don't just stand there. Get her." Two more bikers lunged at Sarah, their eyes filled with fury. But Sarah was ready. As the first biker rushed in, she swiftly swept his legs out from under him. He went down hard, crashing to the ground before he could even register what had happened. Before the second biker could react, she spun on her heel, delivering a devastating strike to his sternum. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and he collapsed, gasping for breath, eyes wide in disbelief. As Sarah surveyed the scene, it became painfully clear to Jax and his crew that they weren't just losing, they were getting. The once cocky laughter of the bikers had been replaced with grunts of pain and disbelief. One by one, they were falling, and the fear was palpable. Jax's anger boiled over, and he took a step back, his mind racing. He had to regain control. His crew lay scattered around the parking lot, groaning in defeat, their confidence shattered. With a furious roar, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife, the blade glinting ominously under the parking lot lights. Sarah's gaze locked onto the knife instantly, her expression unfazed. "Really?" she said, unimpressed, a hint of a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. "You think you're untouchable?" Jax tightened his grip on the knife, his knuckles going white as his fury flared. "You think you can take me on? You're just a little girl playing tough." His words dripped with condescension, but Sarah saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the way his bravado was beginning to crack. "Let's see how tough you really are," he snarled, advancing with the knife poised to strike. In that moment, Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She wasn't just defending herself, she was standing up for everyone who had been bullied, everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of intimidation. As Jax lunged forward, she sidestepped, her body moving fluidly, almost like a dancer. With precision, she grabbed his wrist, twisting it sharply until he dropped the knife, the clatter echoing off the pavement. "Last chance to walk away, Jax," she said, her voice steady and unyielding. "I'm not afraid of you." His pride shattered, Jax stumbled back, realizing for the first time that he had underestimated her completely. The power dynamic had shifted, and it was now clear he was the one in danger. He lunged. Her, catching Jax's wrist mid-strike. It clattered onto the pavement, useless. Before Jax could even register what had happened, Sarah had him his as she leaned in close, her voice, "This is your to walk away." For the Jax's breath came in short. He had been overpowered before. But now, and she wasn't even breaking a sweat. Jax's ego wouldn't let him be. As soon as Sarah released him, he again, a desperate, wild swing. Sarah sent him. He hit the pavement groaning. The remaining bikers, those still conscious, stood frozen, watching their leader like a ragdoll. Sarah took a step back, rolling her shoulders. Then, slowly, she turned to the rest of them. "Anyone else?" Silence. Jax coughed, rolling onto his side. One by one, the bikers. They had followed Jax because he was the butt tonight? He had been by a woman who Sarah exhaled, looking at the scene around her. Then, without another word, the fight was. But that would last a lifetime. The air was the once rowdy bikers, some groaning on the pavement, others scrambling to their feet, the diner door one by one, the regulars, hesitant at first, their eyes. Lisa was among them, clutching a dish rag in her hands. Her gaze, realization dawning on her face. You really took them all down?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Sarah adjusted her jacket, giving a simple shrug. "They gave me no choice." Lisa's lips parted slightly. The silence was broken by the sudden. A police cruiser pulled into the lot, its illuminating the scene. Out stepped an older man, burly, with a weathered face that had seen more than its fair share of trouble. He took one look at the scene, the groaning bikers, Jax clutching his ribs, and Sarah standing there. And then, he chuckled. Sheriff Wheeler stepped forward as he approached Jax, who was still, well, Wheeler drawled, his voice tinged with amusement. "Let me guess. Didn't go the way you planned?" Jax gritted his teeth, but he said the other bikers, their pride just as battered as their bodies. "Sarah," Wheeler turned his gaze to her, "you wouldn't happen to know how all this happened, would you?" Sarah took a sip of her coffee. Where she got it from, nobody knew. Before offering a casual, "They started it." Lisa stifled a laugh. Wheeler glanced at the bikers, raising an eyebrow. "That true, boys?" Out stepped Sheriff Wheeler, an older man, burly, with a weathered face that had seen more than its fair share of trouble. His presence filled the parking lot with an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. He took one look at the scene, the groaning bikers sprawled on the pavement, Jax clutching his ribs, and Sarah standing there, calm and composed amidst the chaos, and then he chuckled, the sound deep and rumbling like distant thunder. It was a familiar sound to the locals, one that spoke of countless encounters with the bikers over the years. Well, Wheeler drawled as he approached Jax, who was still trying to catch his breath, his pride clearly bruised along with his body. "Let me guess. Didn't go the way you planned?" His eyes sparkled with mischief, clearly enjoying the spectacle before him. Jax gritted his teeth, his face a mask of humiliation, but he said nothing. The other bikers stood around him, their pride just as battered as their bodies, shooting glances at one another, unsure how to respond to the sheriff's taunting. "Sarah," Wheeler turned his gaze to her, his expression shifting from amusement to curiosity. "You wouldn't happen to know how all this happened, would you?" His tone was friendly, almost conspiratorial, as if he were in on a joke. Sarah took a sip of her coffee. Where she got it from, nobody knew, but it was clear she was unfazed by the sheriff's scrutiny. She offered a casual, "They started it," with a shrug that suggested a level of indifference. Lisa, standing nearby, stifled a laugh, her eyes wide with admiration for Sarah's nonchalant demeanor. She could hardly believe the situation had unfolded so dramatically and that Sarah was at the center of it. Wheeler glanced at the bikers, raising an eyebrow in challenge. "That true, boys?" His voice carried a weight that demanded honesty, and it was clear he wasn't about to let them off easily. The bikers shifted uncomfortably, the bravado they had carried into the diner evaporating in the face of the sheriff's gaze. One of the bikers, trying to save face, scoffed, "Yeah, but it's not like she didn't provoke us." His voice wavered slightly, betraying his attempt to regain some semblance of dignity. Wheeler's lips curled into a smirk. "Provocation or not, I think we all saw how this played out. Seems like you picked the wrong fight this time." He looked back at Sarah, a hint of respect flickering in his eyes. "Guess the lady can hold her own." The bikers exchanged glances, their collective bravado crumbling under the sheriff's scrutiny. The truth was laid bare, and the weight of their failure hung heavily in the air. Jax, still seething, finally broke the silence. "This isn't over, Wheeler. You know that." Wheeler's expression turned serious. "You know the rules, Jax. You bring trouble here, you'll be the one dealing with it." He gestured to the parking lot, where the defeated bikers slumped against their motorcycles. "Next time, think twice before messing with someone who's clearly out of your league." As Jax and his crew started their bikes, the atmosphere shifted from tense confrontation to quiet resolution. The sound of engines roaring to life filled the air, but this time it was a retreat, not a victory. The bikers drove off, their heads hung low, leaving behind the diner and the undeniable truth of the night. With the commotion finally subsiding, Wheeler turned back to Sarah and Lisa, a smile returning to his face. "Now, how about you two? Want to fill me in on what really happened?" Lisa looked at Sarah, excitement in her eyes. "I think we have a story to tell." Sarah simply nodded, a faint smile breaking her otherwise composed demeanor. Whatever had just transpired, they were in it together now, and that made all the difference. Jax clenched his jaw, his fingers, as if considering a response. But what could he say? He and his crew had been by one woman. And now, the whole town would know. Humiliated, Jax shoved away the biker helping him up. His steps uneven. "Let's go," he growled at his crew. The remaining bikers hesitated, casting wary glances at Sarah before silently obeying. One by one, they climbed onto their motorcycles, engines. Jax threw one last glare over his shoulder, eyes dark with fury. Then, with they disappearing into the night. But everyone knew, not today. Not ever. As the dust settled, Lisa turned to Sarah, eyes still. "Who are you?" she asked. Sarah took another sip of her coffee, gaze steady. "Just someone passing through," she said simply. "Lisa, that's not just some self-defense stuff, is it?" Sarah hesitated for a brief moment. She could have told them. She could have explained her past, the tours overseas, the training, the discipline, the things she had seen, the battles she had fought. But that wasn't who she was anymore. So instead, she just, "Guess I've picked up a thing or two." One by one, the remaining bikers climbed onto their motorcycles, the engines roaring to life, a cacophony of sound that shattered the stillness of the night. The vibrations rattled the very air around them, but it was a sound of retreat, defeat. Jax threw one last glare over his shoulder, his eyes dark with fury and humiliation, a silent promise that this wasn't over. Then, with a final rev of his engine, they tore off into the night, the darkness swallowing them whole. The dust kicked up behind them swirled in the headlights, creating a ghostly haze that hung in the air long after they had vanished. But everyone who had witnessed the confrontation knew this wasn't just another night. This was a turning point, a statement of strength and resilience. Not today. Not ever. As the dust settled and the quiet returned, Lisa turned to Sarah, her eyes wide with a mix of admiration and disbelief. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, still trying to process the whirlwind of events. Sarah took another sip of her coffee, her gaze steady and unfaltering. "Just someone passing through," she replied simply, her tone calm yet enigmatic, as if the truth behind her words was more complex than it seemed. Lisa leaned in, curiosity lighting up her expression. "That's not just some self-defense stuff, is it?" There was a hint of awe in her voice, as if she were on the verge of uncovering a profound secret. Sarah hesitated for a brief moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. She could have told Lisa everything, the truth of her past, the tours overseas that had forged her into the woman she was, the rigorous training that had shaped her skills, the discipline that had become second nature, and the haunting memories of battles fought and friends lost. But as she looked at Lisa, she felt the weight of those experiences, the ghosts of her past pressing down on her. That wasn't who she was anymore. She had left that life behind, choosing instead to forge a new path, away from the violence and chaos. So, instead of sharing her story, she chose simplicity. "Guess I've picked up a thing or two," she said with a shrug, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. It was a deflection, a way to keep the conversation light while protecting the depth of her history. Lisa studied her for a moment, her admiration deepening. "Well, whatever it is, you sure handled those guys," she said, the pride evident in her voice. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone stand up to them like that." Sarah chuckled softly, the tension of the moment fading. "Sometimes you just have to stand your ground," she replied, her tone lightening. "You'd be surprised at what you can handle when you have to." As they sat there, the remnants of the confrontation lingering in the air, Sarah felt a sense of calm wash over her. She may have been passing through, but in this diner, at this moment, she had made a difference. And in that, there was a quiet strength, a reminder that no matter where life led her next, she would always be ready to face whatever came her way. Lisa looked at her. The regulars, men and women who had sat in the diner for years, talking about nothing. She wasn't just some woman in a roadside diner anymore. She was a quiet protector. A force that demanded respect, not through loud words or empty threats, but through Sarah sighed, rolling her shoulders before heading back inside. There was still, and she intended to finish it, the neon sign above the diner. The parking lot was empty now, the last echoes of revving engines fading into the night. Sarah sat at the counter, stirring what was left of her coffee, deep in thought. Strength. So many people misunderstood it. Jack's thought strength was about, but real strength. It wasn't loud. It wasn't boastful. It didn't need an audience. Real strength was she glanced outside once more, watching as the headlights of a lone car disappeared down the highway. Another day. Another town. And for Sarah. She took one last sip of her coffee, savoring the warmth. Then, just like always, she got up and walked out the door, disappearing into the night. The diner wasn't the same after that night. Not because it was broken or damaged. Lisa stood a little. She no longer shrank away when rude customers snapped their fingers or barked orders at her. Instead, she met their eyes, steady and unwavering. She had seen what looked like. And now, she had word through town. Everyone what had happened. How Jax and his gang had rolled in, looking for trouble, and just like that, Jax's gang, the diner, remained a place where people could enjoy their coffee without fear. As for Sarah, she didn't stay. She never did. By the time the sun rose the next morning. Another town. Another stop. Never looking for trouble.